The ocean hides many secrets, but few as haunting as the city that sleeps beneath the Arabian Sea. For thousands of years, storytellers in India spoke of a magnificent city built by a god, a city of shining walls, golden towers, and music that floated over the waves. They called it Dwarka, the city of Krishna. To believers, it was a place of divine splendor, where the sea itself bowed to its king. To skeptics, it was only a myth, one of the countless tales woven into the vast fabric of Hindu legend. Yet today, on the ocean floor near the coast of Gujarat, something stirs. Among the sands and the tides, stone blocks and shattered pillars lie in silence, as if waiting for memory to return. For centuries, Dwarka was known only through ancient texts, the Mahabharata, the Skanda Purana, and the Harivamsa. These scriptures described it not as an ordinary city, but as one built by celestial architects. When Lord Krishna left his birthplace of Mathura, it is said he founded Dwarka on the western shore, crafting it with walls of crystal, floors of silver, and gates that shone like the rising sun. It was a city of 900 palaces, each adorned with gems and gold. The sea embraced it, surrounding it on all sides, its waves reflecting the light of lamps that burn day and night. It was said that from its balconies one could see the horizon curve, a divine vision of perfection, a meeting of heaven and earth. But the story of Dwarka does not end in glory. According to legend, when Krishna's time on earth came to an end, he left the city, and the sea, mourning his departure, rose to reclaim what he had built. The city vanished beneath the waves, swallowed whole in a single night. The faithful believed it was taken to the depths, not destroyed but preserved, a sacred city hidden in the ocean, waiting for the world to remember. Generations passed, and Dwarka became a legend told by priests and poets, a symbol of divine loss and eternal return. No one truly believed they would ever see it again. That changed in the year 1983. Off the coast of modern Dwarka, a small pilgrimage town on the edge of Gujarat, a team of Indian archaeologists led by S.R. Rao began an underwater survey. They were searching for remains of early settlements along the continental shelf, part of a broader effort to trace India's ancient maritime roots. No one expected to find anything more than pottery shards or lost anchors, but when the divers descended into the green-blue haze, they saw something they could not explain. Beneath the murky water, the seafloor was not smooth sand, it was patterned. Rectangular outlines, perfect right angles, long parallel walls. The ocean floor looked like a map drawn by human hands. As the divers swam closer, the shapes became clearer, massive stone blocks, perfectly cut and placed in rows. Some formed foundations, others what appeared to be walls and steps. One diver surfaced and said simply, "There is a city down there." At first, the claim was dismissed as enthusiasm, but when photographs and sonar scans were analyzed, the evidence was undeniable. The site covered several square kilometers. Streets and grid-like structures ran in deliberate patterns. It was not random. It was man-made. The world's oldest submerged city, perhaps. The findings electrified India. Newspapers called it the Atlantis of the East. To many, it was proof that the ancient scriptures had been right all along. To others, it was an archaeological enigma that threatened to rewrite history. If the ruins were truly 9,000 years old, as early carbon samples from artifacts suggested, then they predated every known civilization on Earth from Sumer to Egypt. It would mean that organized urban life had begun not in Mesopotamia, but here on the shores of the Arabian Sea. But science moves cautiously. The ruins lay under deep, shifting currents covered by silt and coral. Visibility was poor. Excavations were dangerous. The team returned year after year, mapping and sampling, trying to determine if these were indeed the remains of a city or a natural formation mistaken for one. What they found only deepened the mystery. Pottery fragments, tools made of stone and copper, and even a piece of wood embedded in sediment were recovered. When the wood was tested with radiocarbon dating, it yielded a result that shocked everyone, approximately 9,500 years old. That placed it around 7,500 BCE, centuries before the first pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the dawn of recorded history. If true, this meant Dwarka was not just old, it was impossibly old. Too old. Some scholars rejected the finding outright, arguing that the wooden fragment might have drifted into the site from elsewhere. Others suggested the structures were natural formations shaped by currents. Yet divers reported consistent geometry, steps, walls, platforms, and even what looked like a dockyard. To those who saw it firsthand, it was not nature's work. It was the work of hands, hands that had long since turned to dust. The Indian government, cautious but intrigued, authorized continued exploration. The Marine Archaeology Unit of the National Institute of Oceanography took over the surveys using side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and underwater cameras. What emerged was an image of a drowned landscape. Not a single city, but a network of them, scattered along the Gulf's edge, as if an entire civilization had once thrived here before the ocean claimed it. And so the legend returned, not as scripture, but as evidence. The city of the gods was real, or at least something was. Whether it was Krishna's Dwarka or the remnant of another forgotten culture, no one could yet say. But one thing was certain: the sea had preserved something extraordinary. Beneath the waves, time itself seemed to pause. The walls lay in silence, the streets empty, the temples collapsed but not erased. It was as if the ocean had become the city's guardian, holding its memory in a blue grave. Long before Dwarka became a name whispered by divers and archaeologists, it was a living vision carried in the hearts of millions. To the people of India, the story of Lord Krishna is not myth, it is memory. The Mahabharata tells us that when Krishna left his birthplace of Mathura to escape the wrath of enemies, he journeyed westward toward the sea. There, he called upon the divine architect Vishwakarma to build a new city, one that no army could reach. The sea withdrew, making space for its creation. Upon that newly exposed land, Krishna built Dwarka, a city so splendid that it rivaled the heavens themselves. The scriptures describe it with such precision that for centuries, pilgrims could almost see it in their minds. Walls gleaming with jewels, balconies that overlooked gardens bursting with flowers, courtyards paved in crystal, and a harbor lined with ships from distant lands trading gold, spices, and pearls. It was not just a city of faith, but of power, the capital of Krishna's kingdom, Yadava, and a place where gods and mortals walked side by side. The sound of conch shells and temple bells echoed from dawn to dusk, mingling with the endless rhythm of the sea. But the story of Dwarka was never meant to last forever. In the Mahabharata, the city's fate is foretold. After the great war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, a war Krishna tried to prevent, peace never truly returned. The Yadava people turned upon each other in anger and pride. Krishna, heartbroken, left the city and walked alone into the forest. There, under the shade of a tree, he was struck by a hunter's arrow and left his mortal form. And when he was gone, the ocean rose. The waves swept in silently, covering palaces, temples, and streets. In one night, the city of the gods disappeared. The sea, the text says, claimed what belonged to it. For most of history, the story remained a symbol, a lesson on impermanence, not a fact of archaeology. But when divers began finding evidence of stone walls beneath the sea, the line between myth and reality blurred. What if Dwarka had truly existed? What if the storytellers had not invented but remembered? The more scientists studied the waters off Gujarat, the more the legend gained weight. Not far from modern Dwarka, a temple town that pilgrims visit to this day, the underwater remains seem to match the descriptions found in the Mahabharata. A city by the sea with harbors, docks, and large gates. The discovery stirred a kind of reverence that few scientific findings ever do. Even hardened archaeologists spoke softly when discussing it, as if careful not to disturb something sacred. S.R. Rao, the archaeologist leading the exploration, wrote that the structures underwater appeared to be a well-organized township with walls, platforms, and rectangular layouts consistent with ancient Indian urban planning. He called it a city lost to the sea. For the people of India, it was proof that their history was not just story, but heritage, that their ancestors had built cities and sailed oceans when much of the world still lived in small tribes. In the years that followed, divers retrieved dozens of artifacts from the seabed: pottery, beads, and tools. Each piece was carefully studied, cleaned, and dated. Some belonged to the early Harappan period, around 2600 BCE. Others seemed even older. The carbon dating of wooden fragments, suggesting a date near 7500 BCE, was so astonishing that it divided the academic world. If true, Dwarka was not only ancient, it was older than any known civilization. It would force history to be rewritten, but science does not yield to faith easily. Many scholars urged caution, arguing that the dating might not reflect the city's true age, that ocean currents could have mixed older materials with newer ruins. The sea is a restless archive. It does not keep records in order. And yet, the geometry of the underwater structures was undeniable. Straight lines, right angles, foundations too deliberate to be random. Even the spacing between them hinted at planning. The evidence pointed to an organized settlement, large and complex, that had once stood proudly above the surface. In the temples of modern Dwarka, priests began to speak of the discovery as destiny, a sign that the ocean was giving back what it once took. Pilgrims arrived in larger numbers, bringing offerings not just to Krishna, but to the sea itself. On calm days, they looked toward the water and imagined the city shining below, its towers still glowing in the filtered sunlight, its streets waiting for footsteps that would never return. The myth of Dwarka had always been about divine loss, about a perfect world reclaimed by nature. But now it became something more, a bridge between history and faith. Whether the ruins belonged to Krishna's city or another forgotten culture, they carried the same message. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, but their echoes endure, sometimes in words, sometimes in stone, sometimes beneath the waves. The divers who descended into the Gulf of Kambat described the experience in words that bordered on reverence. It felt, one said, like entering a memory that didn't belong to me. Another recalled brushing sand from a step carved so cleanly it seemed new, untouched by 9,000 years. It was, he said, like the sea had been guarding it all this time. Above the waves, the debate continued, scholars arguing, governments funding new surveys, believers celebrating an ancient promise fulfilled. But beneath, in the quiet blue, the stones remained unmoved. They did not care for names or proofs. They simply waited, the same way they had waited for thousands of years. And so Dwarka lived again, half in story, half in stone. A city remembered not just in sacred text, but in the shifting light of the ocean. A reminder that myth and history are not enemies, they are echoes of the same truth, heard differently through time. The sea around the coast of Gujarat looks calm from above, a vast glittering expanse of blue that breaks into white foam along the shore. But beneath its surface the currents are fierce. Visibility shifts with the tides. The silt rises and falls like a living thing. For centuries, no one imagined that an entire city might lie hidden down there, entombed by time and water. When the team led by S.R. Rao returned to the waters near modern Dwarka, they brought with them divers, sonar equipment, and a quiet sense of disbelief. They had read the ancient texts, the stories of Krishna's city, but even the most hopeful among them doubted they would find anything more than scattered debris, a few remnants of ancient trade. Yet, within hours of descending into the sea, that doubt began to unravel. The first thing they saw was not a wall or a pillar. It was order, patterns that nature does not make. Rectangular alignments appeared faintly beneath a veil of sand, sharp lines against the soft seabed. The divers followed them carefully, marking positions, tracing edges. One diver reached out and brushed away a layer of silt, revealing smooth-cut stone. It was not coral, not rock eroded by the tide, but shaped by human hands. Steps emerged, leading down into nothingness. A foundation, perhaps. A platform. A threshold to a vanished world. Each dive brought new revelations, massive stone blocks arranged in grids. Sections of what appeared to be streets. Pillars that had fallen long ago, their tops buried deep beneath sediment. The ocean floor was a graveyard of geometry, preserved by the sea. It was like walking through a dream, one diver wrote later. You could feel that people had once lived here. You could feel the silence they left behind. Back on the surface, the sonar readings confirmed what the eyes had seen. The shapes were consistent, rectangular structures arranged in clusters, separated by straight channels that looked eerily like streets. Some areas seemed circular, possibly courtyards or temple grounds. The team began to map it all, realizing that the ruins extended far beyond what they expected. Dwarka was not a small settlement. It was a metropolis, sprawling and deliberate. The most striking discovery came from a depth of about 36 meters, where divers found what appeared to be the remains of a massive wall stretching nearly half a kilometer. It curved gently, following the contours of the seabed, as though once it had protected something sacred. Nearby, they found stone anchors, the kind used by ancient ships, proof that this had once been a port. The realization settled in slowly. This city had once been alive with trade, its harbors open to the world. But the sea gives nothing without cost. The deeper the divers went, the stronger the currents became. Visibility dropped to less than a meter. The seabed shifted with every touch, threatening to erase what they had just uncovered. One diver described the experience as trying to map a ghost. Yet the team persisted, marking coordinates, taking photographs, and bringing small artifacts to the surface for study. Among the recovered objects were pottery shards, beads, and fragments of tools. Some were simple, others surprisingly refined. One piece, a smooth, circular object carved from stone, seemed designed for purpose, though no one could determine what. Another diver found a fragment of wood trapped between stones, its grain still visible. It was carefully sealed and sent for carbon testing, though no one expected much from it. When the results came back, the room fell silent. The sample dated to nearly 9,500 years ago. The implications were staggering. If this wood truly belonged to the city's foundation, it meant that Dwarka predated every known civilization by thousands of years. The Harappan cities, long considered the cradle of Indian urban culture, were mere newcomers in comparison. Even Mesopotamia, often called the birthplace of civilization, was younger. The sea, it seemed, had been guarding a secret older than human memory. Not everyone accepted the findings. Skeptics argued that ocean currents could move materials from distant ages, confusing the results. Some said the structures were natural, rock formations shaped by erosion, their straight lines an illusion. But those who had seen the site disagreed. The geometry was too precise, too deliberate. The angles repeated. The alignments followed patterns that echoed known ancient city plans. Nature may carve beauty, but it rarely carves symmetry. The government funded further expeditions. The National Institute of Oceanography deployed side-scan sonar to capture detailed imagery of the underwater terrain. Slowly, a map began to form, not of one ruin, but of many. It seemed that several settlements spread across the Gulf had been drowned at different times. Dwarka was only one among them, perhaps the crown jewel of an entire drowned civilization. The most haunting moment came during one dive, when a diver shone his light across a series of fallen pillars. The beams revealed something faintly carved into the stone, lines and curves, worn by time but unmistakably human. They could have been markings, inscriptions, or perhaps simple decoration. The diver hovered there, motionless, his breathing echoing through his mask. It was, he later said, like looking at handwriting from the bottom of the sea. When the team surfaced that evening, the horizon was red with sunset. They sat in silence, knowing they had touched something few humans ever would, the remains of a world that had existed before the world we know. Beneath them lay a city that once stood in the sun, where ships sailed, voices echoed, and temples rose toward the sky. Now, it lay in silence, the sea its only witness. Dwarka was no longer a myth, it was stone, silt, and time. A city drowned but not forgotten. And as the waves rolled softly against the hull, S.R. Rao looked out toward the fading light and said something that would stay with every member of the team. We have found memory itself. For years, the question haunted every researcher who touched the stones of Dwarka. Who built this city beneath the sea? It was one thing to find ruins, but another to imagine the people who once walked those streets. The ocean guards their silence well. No written record has survived, but the stones themselves whisper. They tell of a civilization that was far from primitive, one that mastered engineering, trade, and perhaps even navigation long before history admits such things existed. When the sonar images were analyzed, one thing stood out: the precision. The layout of Dwarka was not chaotic. Streets intersected at right angles, forming a grid-like pattern. The buildings were arranged in clusters, suggesting planning and purpose. This was not a settlement that grew accidentally. It was designed. The architects who built it understood geometry and structure. They knew how to balance stone and water, how to carve symmetry from chaos. They were builders, thinkers, and sailors. Archaeologists studying the site noticed similarities with other ancient coastal settlements of the Indian subcontinent, especially those linked to the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. Like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, Dwarka seemed to have docks, warehouses, and drainage systems. But if the dating was correct, Dwarka was thousands of years older. That meant it wasn't influenced by Harappa. It might have preceded it. If that were true, the people of Dwarka were among the first city builders on Earth. They were the ancestors of civilization itself. The sea floor revealed further clues. Stone anchors, some large enough for massive vessels, hinted at a thriving port. India's western coast had always been a crossroads of trade, linking Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. But Dwarka's scale suggested a maritime culture so advanced that it could navigate long distances centuries before the Egyptians sailed the Nile. Underwater currents had preserved anchors carved from basalt and limestone, still showing grooves for ropes that had long turned to dust. One researcher described it as the earliest evidence of organized sea trade known to mankind. The artifacts retrieved from the ruins told a similar story. Beads made of carnelian, a semi-precious stone prized for its deep red hue, had been found in abundance. They matched similar beads from faraway regions, Mesopotamia, Bahrain, and Oman. The resemblance was too close to be coincidence. These were trade goods, exchanged across oceans that modern history claims were uncharted. If Dwarka's merchants traded with Sumer, it would mean two of the world's earliest civilizations were connected by sea thousands of years before conventional history says they could have been. Pottery fragments were found, each marked with unique designs, geometric motifs, waves, and spirals. Though worn by time, the craftsmanship was undeniable. The clay had been fired at high temperatures, a technique that required controlled kilns. Some pieces bore traces of glaze, an innovation once thought to appear millennia later. Tools of copper and bronze also surfaced, suggesting the people of Dwarka had already entered a metal age of their own, forging weapons and instruments from ores mined deep inland and carried to the coast by river and caravan. It is easy to forget, when speaking of ancient cities, that they were once full of life. Somewhere above those buried stones, families built their homes, fishermen pulled their nets, priests lit lamps before dawn, children ran through streets that now sleep beneath coral. Each echo of their world remains, fossilized in silence. The divers who brushed sand from steps and doorways could almost sense it, the presence of hands, the rhythm of a city that once breathed in sunlight. The scale of Dwarka's submersion suggests that the flooding was not a single event. Geological studies show that the sea level in the region rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. As glaciers melted, entire coastlines vanished. Dwarka, it seems, was one of many cities swallowed by the sea during that global catastrophe. The waves advanced year by year, claiming farmland, then temples, then homes, until finally the city was gone. For the people who lived there, it must have been slow devastation, not a mythic punishment, but the steady, unstoppable rise of the ocean. And yet, the legend preserved it perfectly. When the Mahabharata speaks of Dwarka's destruction, it does not describe fire or war, only water. The sea covered the city in a single night, it says, leaving no trace of its walls. What might have taken decades in nature was remembered as a moment, an act of divine grief. But whether told as myth or measured as science, the ending is the same. The city vanished beneath the tide. Modern researchers have compared Dwarka's story to other drowned worlds: the lost city of Heraklion in Egypt, the ruins off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, the flooded valleys of Doggerland in Europe. Each of them speaks of a time when the world's geography shifted, when land became sea and memory turned into legend. Dwarka fits perfectly among them, not as a fantasy, but as a survivor of prehistory's greatest flood. If these ruins truly belong to an early, forgotten civilization, then Dwarka changes everything. It suggests that human culture did not progress in a straight line from primitive to advanced. It rose, fell, and rose again. Civilizations building atop the bones of those that came before, and perhaps this is why the story of Dwarka endured for so long. It is not only about Krishna or faith, but about memory itself. Humanity forgets, and then remembers. In the laboratories of Goa and New Delhi, scientists continued to study each artifact, each grain of sand taken from the ocean floor. They found traces of ancient plankton in the sediment, organisms that only thrive in shallow coastal waters. That meant the area had once been land, not sea. It was proof that the structures now drowned had stood on dry ground. The ocean had indeed advanced. The story was real. And so, bit by bit, The outline of a vanished civilization emerged, a people of builders, sailors, and storytellers who watched their world sink into the sea. They left behind no written words, no monuments on land, only stone foundations beneath the waves, and a legend that refused to die. Dwarka was not just a city, it was a mirror, showing us that even the oldest myths may hide the oldest truths. News of Dwarka's discovery spread across the world like a spark. To believers, it was proof that the words of the Mahabharata were history, not myth. To skeptics, it was another Atlantis, a beautiful story inflated by hope. Between those two worlds stood the archaeologists, the divers, and the scientists, trying to explain what they had found on the ocean floor. In the early 2000s, the National Institute of Oceanography released its first detailed maps of the site. The patterns were unmistakable: rows of foundations, channels that looked like streets, and harbor-like depressions along the seabed. Indian media called it the lost city of Krishna. International headlines were less kind, using words like controversial, unverified, and myth-driven. The debate had begun. Western archaeologists questioned the dating of the wooden fragment that had yielded the astonishing 9,500-year figure. They argued that ocean currents could easily move older material into younger strata. If that were true, the ruins might be far more recent, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years old, placing them within the known range of Bronze Age India. But others countered that the structure's scale, design, and apparent submersion pattern matched a much older geological timeline, one consistent with the flooding that followed the last ice age. The arguments filled conferences and journals. For every claim, there was a counterclaim. One side pointed to sonar images showing straight walls, docks, and buildings. The other said that nature, too, can carve order from chaos. Erosion, fracture lines, and coral growth can create deceptive symmetry. But beneath the surface of academic caution lay something deeper. If Dwarka truly were that ancient, it would rewrite the story of civilization itself. The idea was too vast, too destabilizing, for many to accept easily. Within India, the discovery stirred pride, a reclamation of a heritage long dismissed as legend. Television crews followed archaeologists to the coast, filming divers as they prepared to descend into the murky water. The images were cinematic, men vanishing into the sea, cameras following the beams of their lights as they touched stones that had slept for millennia. When they surfaced, holding artifacts darkened by salt and age, the crowd on the research vessel would fall silent. Something sacred had been touched. But science demanded patience. Each artifact had to be dated, catalogued, and compared with land sites along the Gujarat coast. Excavations on shore revealed pottery and structures similar to those underwater, hinting at a continuity, as if the same people had once lived on land and later moved toward the sea before it rose. Ancient river channels, now buried, were traced with sonar, showing that water once flowed where now only currents move. The data aligned with climate models that showed a steady sea level rise, the kind of slow drowning that turns villages into myths over generations. Still, controversy followed. Foreign experts demanded open access to samples. Nationalists accused them of dismissing India's history out of bias. Conspiracy theories emerged. Claims that governments were hiding the truth, that the ruins proved an antediluvian global civilization erased by flood. In the middle of the storm, the scientists simply kept working. Their task was not to prove a myth, but to measure a mystery. As technology advanced, so did the evidence. By the 2010s, new high-resolution sonar and LiDAR systems mapped the Gulf in unprecedented detail. They revealed terraces, basin-like depressions, and what appeared to be harbor structures shaped to shelter ships from current. Computer models reconstructed the terrain as it might have looked before the flooding, a network of settlements stretching for miles along a fertile delta. Dwarka, it seemed, was not a single city, but part of a vanished coastline civilization. Marine geologists confirmed that the seabed's sediment layers matched a rapid inundation event around 8,000 years ago, a time when glaciers melted and oceans surged. The correlation strengthened the case. Whatever these ruins were, they belonged to a world that existed before the known empires of man. Still, the scientific establishment remained cautious. To claim Dwarka as the oldest city on Earth required more than sonar. It required irrefutable, datable, and repeatable evidence. That the ocean rarely grants. Yet the story refused to fade. Each new expedition added fragments, anchors, beads, pottery, tools, until the silence of the seabed began to sound like testimony. In Goa's marine archaeology labs, researchers reconstructed one anchor after another, the grooves still visible where ropes had once been tied. They found wear patterns consistent with constant motion, proof that these were not ceremonial objects, but working tools of sailors. Whoever lived in Dwarka had mastered the sea. In universities around the world, lectures began to include the phrase pre-Harappan coastal settlements. The very language of history shifted. Dwarka was no longer a myth to be dismissed, nor a fact to be declared. It was a question that refused to close. And questions, once opened, do not drown easily. Among India's pilgrims, the discovery changed little. They had never needed proof. To them, Krishna's city had always existed, not only beneath the sea, but within the rhythm of prayer and the turning of tides. The divers, though, spoke differently. They had seen it. They had swum through doorways that once framed sunlight. They had felt the weight of water pressing against stone and known that they were touching something beyond explanation. One diver later said that at a depth of 20 meters, he turned off his torch for a moment and waited. In the dark, he heard the faint hiss of his own breath and the distant hum of the current. For a heartbeat, he thought he could hear something else, a tone, a vibration, the ghost of a bell. He surfaced trembling, unable to say whether it was memory or sound. Perhaps, he thought, the sea still remembers. In the end, controversy became part of Dwarka's identity. It lived halfway between proof and faith, between science and scripture. Each new discovery reopened the argument. Each unanswered question deepened its power. Maybe that is what keeps the city alive, the tension between what we can measure and what we can only believe. And so, beneath the waves, the stones remain. They do not argue. They do not care who claims them. They simply wait, enduring, while above them the debate continues, a chorus of certainty and doubt carried on the same wind that once filled Dwarka's sails. There are moments in the history of this planet when the earth itself seems to breathe, when mountains shift, rivers move, and the line between land and ocean blurs. The end of the last ice age was one of those moments. It was a time of melting, of transformation, of endings and beginnings. And somewhere on the western coast of India, the people of Dwarka watched as the sea began to rise. Geologists describe it in simple terms. The world warmed, the ice melted, and the oceans rose by more than 100 meters. But for those who lived through it, it was not science. It was terror. The tides that once obeyed the moon began to disobey. The shoreline crept inland, swallowing fields and temples. The air carried salt where once it carried dust. The horizon changed shape, and the sea, that old friend of trade and travel, became a slow, advancing enemy. The signs must have been visible for years before the end. Perhaps the priests saw it first, the waters climbing the steps of their shrines, the river mouths widening. Perhaps fishermen noticed the currents changing, their boats pushed inland by tides that were never so strong before. At first, it would have seemed temporary. Floods always recede, the sea always retreats. But this time, it did not. Each season brought more water, more storms, more land lost to the waves. In the Mahabharata, the destruction of Dwarka comes after the death of Krishna. It says the city, once radiant with gold and sound, fell silent as its people left. Then, one night, the sea rose and took it all. To the storytellers, it was divine judgment, the end of an age. To science, it was the slow hand of climate, erasing coastlines across the globe. But in truth, the difference between myth and geology may only be the language we use to describe memory. The evidence lies beneath every ocean. Archaeologists have found ancient riverbeds under the Persian Gulf, submerged villages off the coast of Japan, and entire forests drowned off Britain's shores. These are not fairy tales. They are the scars of the same event that claimed Dwarka. The Earth's ice melted faster than its people could move. The oceans rose like a tide that would never fall. It was not one flood, but 1,000, spread across centuries. A collective drowning of civilizations too early to be remembered, too late to be recorded. The region around the Gulf of Kambat shows clear signs of this transformation. Core samples pulled from the seabed contain layers of silt and marine sediment stacked like pages in a book. In those layers, scientists have found traces of pollen from coastal plants, shells from shallow waters, and charcoal from ancient fires. The story is there, in data and dust. This was once land, inhabited, cultivated, and alive, before it became sea. For the people of Dwarka, the end would have come slowly. Perhaps they built walls to hold the water back. Perhaps they moved their temples inland, stone by stone, as the sea advanced. But there is a moment in every struggle when resistance becomes surrender. When the water reached the heart of the city, there would have been no time left. The boats that once brought wealth might have carried refugees instead. The great harbor, once filled with ships, became a graveyard of anchors. What they could not save, they would have buried: idols, relics, the emblems of gods they prayed would protect them. The divers who found carved stones at Dwarka often noticed how many lay stacked together, as if once they had been deliberately lowered into the sea. Some archaeologists believe these were temple foundations, swallowed in place. Others think they were votive offerings, acts of devotion from people who knew the end had come and wanted to offer their world to the waves rather than let it vanish without grace. As the city fell, the memory of it was already being woven into legend. The survivors moved inland, carrying stories instead of possessions. They spoke of a shining city built by Krishna himself, a city so magnificent that even the gods envied it. They said it was destined to be reclaimed by the ocean when its time was done. In that story, loss became destiny, and catastrophe became prophecy fulfilled. Over generations, the flood became divine, the sea became sacred, and Dwarka became eternal. Modern scientists reading sediment layers and satellite data may never use such words, but they describe the same thing. The sea rose, the city sank, and humanity endured. Every civilization leaves behind a boundary between land and water, a line drawn in sand that will someday be erased. Dwarka's story is not unique. It is the most eloquent example of something universal. Every empire, no matter how advanced, eventually faces its own flood. For thousands of years after Dwarka's disappearance, the sea guarded its secret. The coastline shifted, new rivers carved new paths, and the memory of the drowned city drifted into myth. Only when humans learned to dive deep, to bring light into darkness, did the truth return. The ocean had preserved everything it took: the stones, the streets, the walls. The city was gone, but not lost. When modern divers glide through those ruins, they are seeing the moment when myth and science meet, when a story told in sacred verse becomes a visible, tangible truth. The sea, indifferent and eternal, has become the last historian. It remembers what we forget. It keeps what we lose. And so, the legend of Dwarka is not only about what happened long ago, it is also a warning. Civilizations rise beside the sea because the sea gives life, trade, food, connection. But the sea always returns to claim what is hers. In a time when oceans rise again, Dwarka feels less like a myth and more like a message, whispered through water and stone. Nothing built on the shore lasts forever. When the divers packed their equipment and the last sonar pulse faded into silence, the city beneath the waves remained, unchanged, untouched, patient. The story of Dwarka did not end with its discovery. It began again. What had once been myth became evidence, and what had once been faith became a bridge between worlds, science, history, and belief. In India, the rediscovery of Dwarka became more than an archaeological event. It became a reminder that the stories carried through centuries are not simply imagination, but memory translated into poetry. Pilgrims continued to visit the modern city of Dwarka on the shore, lighting lamps at the temples that face the sea. When the tide goes out, the waves reveal stones blackened by time, and people whisper that they belong to the ancient city below. Every evening, the sound of bells drifts across the water, as if calling to those who never returned from the flood. For historians, Dwarka reshaped how they viewed the ancient world. It showed that human civilization may have deeper roots than written history records. Cities could have risen and fallen before the ones we know, their ruins scattered across seabeds, their names preserved only in legend. Dwarka became a symbol of that lost prehistory, a sign that myth and memory can sometimes hold truths that science rediscovers thousands of years later. The underwater city also changed the way people think about the boundaries of knowledge. In universities and laboratories, students studied satellite images of the Gulf of Cambodge, searching for patterns that might reveal other ancient coastlines. New technology, drones, submersibles, and 3D sonar turned the ocean into a new frontier of archaeology. What once seemed like fantasy a city built in the age of gods, became a research question, measurable and testable. And with every discovery, the line between history and legend blurred just a little more. Spiritually, Dwarka remains eternal. In Hindu tradition, Krishna's Dwarka is not simply a city, it is an ideal, a place of beauty, order, and divine presence. Its destruction is not tragedy, but transformation. The sea taking it back is seen not as punishment, but as renewal, a reminder that even divine creations must yield to the rhythm of time. In that sense, Dwarka's drowning mirrors the human condition. Everything we build eventually returns to the elements, but the essence, the story, endures. The divers who visited the ruins often spoke of a strange peace below the waves. Surrounded by silence, by the remains of walls and steps, they felt not fear or loss, but reverence. Some said it was like entering a temple without a roof, where the sea itself had become the ceiling. The light filtering through the water seemed sacred, soft, blue, eternal. In that stillness, one could almost believe that Krishna's city still lives, suspended between this world and another. Outside India, Dwarka continues to fuel fascination. Documentaries, expeditions, and research papers have all tried to capture its mystery. To some, it is proof that advanced civilizations existed long before recorded time. To others, it is a case study in how geology and faith can intersect. Whatever the interpretation, one truth remains. Dwarka connects the human story to the sea, the first and oldest archive on Earth. For the people who live along the coast today, the ocean's rhythm still shapes life as it did thousands of years ago. Fishermen in small wooden boats cross the same waters that once carried the merchants of Dwarka. When storms roll in, they tie their boats and wait. The elders point toward the horizon and say that under those waves the gods still sleep. And when the wind falls silent, you can almost hear the sea breathing, a deep, endless sound that has outlived every empire. As evening falls over modern Dwarka, the temple bells ring again. Pilgrims gather by the shore, their lamps glowing like stars reflected in water. Far beneath them, the ruins lie in darkness, their stones motionless, their silence unbroken. Yet, in that silence, something endures. The echo of voices, the hum of ritual, the memory of light. The city of the gods has not vanished. It has merely changed form. Dwarka's legacy is not measured in ruins or relics, but in what it awakens in us: wonder, humility, and the awareness that the past is never truly gone. The ocean keeps our oldest stories, waiting for us to remember. One day, when another diver descends into the depths, brushing away the silt of centuries, perhaps more of Dwarka will return, not to prove or disprove belief, but to remind us that time is vast and memory deeper than the sea. The waves roll on, eternal and unbroken, and beneath them, Dwarka waits, the city of the gods, the city of the sea, the city that refused to die.